The early morning sun bathed the orchard in golden light, dew still clinging to the grass as birds chirped lazily between rows of apple trees. Tom Ellery, a quiet but sharp-witted man in his late 40s, stood on the porch of his modest farmhouse sipping coffee and admiring the serenity of his land. His pigs, a dozen muddy and perpetually hungry characters, snorted and waddled around their sty on the far end of the property. It was the kind of peaceful life Tom had spent years building, a blend of hard work, good soil, and just enough isolation from town life. Everything about Tom's little farm ran like clockwork, until that particular Saturday morning when he noticed something odd gleaming between the trees. Narrowing his eyes, he stepped off the porch and followed the shimmer through his orchard, pushing past low-hanging branches until he stopped dead in his tracks. There, strung high between two massive oak trees and cutting straight through his orchard, was a bright neon-orange zipline cable. It stretched from just beyond his northern fence, technically still part of his land but bordering the backyards of the newly built Oak Crest estates, and ran diagonally downward, ending suspiciously close to his pigsty. Before he could fully wrap his head around it, a high-pitched shriek split the air, followed by the rapid whir of pulleys. Tom barely had time to step back before a kid, helmeted, giggling, and clearly having the time of his life, came hurtling down the line. The child soared over Tom's apples, then squealed in terror as he overshot the landing platform and crash-landed into a muddy patch just feet from the pigs. The pigs snorted in protest as the boy scrambled up, smeared in mud and orchard debris, and took off running back up the hill. Tom stared in disbelief, a zipline through his orchard, ending at his pigs. The next thing he heard was the shrill voice that had haunted neighborhood meetings since the beginning of time. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Mr. Ellery. It's just for the kids." Turning toward the noise, Tom saw her, Corinne Prescott, self-declared HOA president of Oak Crest and permanent thorn in everyone's side. Clad in pastel athleisure and a smug expression, she stood on her perfectly manicured side of the fence, sipping from an oversized glitter tumbler. Tom blinked slowly. "Did you just install a zipline over my orchard?" Corinne waved dismissively. "Technically, it's a shared view corridor and the kids needed some excitement. You don't mind a little fun, do you?" Tom's grip tightened around his coffee mug. He did mind, very much. But more than that, he could already feel it. This wasn't just a mistake. This was going to be a battle. Tom's disbelief slowly transformed into simmering anger as he stood in the orchard, watching Corinne supervise a group of kids like some deranged summer camp counselor. The zipline, his zipline, technically trespassing over his orchard, now had a waiting line. Children, none of whom he recognized, took turns launching themselves from a freshly built wooden platform just past the Oak Crest fence. Every time they zipped across, Tom could hear Corinne's chipper voice calling out safety tips like she was the zipline queen of suburbia. He stormed back toward the fence line, ducking under the cable, and stared Corinne down as she prattled on about neighborhood cohesion and making the most of shared views. "Corinne," he said firmly, "this is private property. You've built an attraction on my land without asking. That's illegal." Corinne tilted her head with a smirk, pulling her oversized sunglasses down just enough to meet his glare. "Oh, Tom, you're always so territorial. It's just a little cable. It doesn't even touch your trees. And besides, the kids love it." She clapped her hands as a little girl zipped down the line and landed, again far too close to the pigs. "See, joy." Tom crossed his arms. "It's not about joy, it's about trespassing and liability and basic respect." "Oh, lighten up," she chirped. "I ran it by the HOA board. They said it was a fun community project." "You ran it by yourself, Corinne. You are the HOA board." "Exactly, efficient governance," she winked. That night, Tom tried to let it go. He called the local zoning office, left a message with the sheriff's department, even drafted a polite letter of complaint to the Oak Crest Estates management company. But by the next morning, the zipline had gained traction. Literally. Corinne had added decorative flags to the cable. She was now handing out homemade zip and dip coupons for lemonade and cookies in her backyard. She'd even placed a welcome sign on the back fence. The KARENLAND-ZIPLINE experience, thrills with a view. Tom couldn't believe it. His orchard, The peaceful stretch of land he had worked his whole life to protect was now being violated daily by shrieking children and careless parents who treated his property like part of a theme park. When a third kid landed directly in the pig trough, prompting a chaotic pig chase and a ruined pair of expensive sneakers, Tom decided enough was enough. Karen had crossed a line. No, ziplined over it, and she wasn't going to stop until someone stopped her. So Tom began to plan, not just a complaint, not just a warning. He needed something poetic, something unforgettable. By the end of the week, the zipline had become a full-fledged neighborhood attraction. Cars lined the edge of the Oak Crest cul-de-sac every afternoon. Parents brought snacks and folding chairs, turning Karen's backyard into a mini fairground. Kids ran back and forth through the orchard like it was their personal playground, knocking over buckets, trampling fallen apples, and scaring Tom's chickens half to death. Karen had gone full carnival host. She wore a glittering whistle around her neck, carried a clipboard labeled waiver signatures, and had even begun charging $5 per ride, though she called it a donation to the HOA fund. She waved to Tom like they were co-owners of this ridiculous operation, shouting over the laughter and zipline whirring, "Isn't this fabulous? You're really part of something special here." Tom's orchard was suffering. Branches snapped from kids grabbing apples mid-ride. His irrigation lines had been stepped on and cracked in 3 places. One of the pigs had developed a nervous habit of sprinting in circles every time a child came flying toward the sty. The place was turning into chaos, and no one seemed to care, least of all Karen, who continued to act like she was running Disneyland for suburban thrill-seekers. When Tom tried to stop a teenage boy from running through his field, Karen accused him, loudly, of killing the neighborhood spirit. Parents glared. Kids booed. Someone even called him a fun vampire. Tom stood in his own orchard being villainized for protecting his property, while Karen basked in applause for her vision. The final straw came that Friday evening. It was just past sunset. The last of the kids were being ushered away, and Karen was busy collecting her folding tables. Tom walked toward the orchard to do a quick check before nightfall and stepped in a discarded juice pouch, right next to a crushed seedling he had planted 2 weeks ago. He scanned the area and counted 3 more broken saplings, torn chicken wire, and a fresh pile of candy wrappers near the sty. Then he noticed something new: floodlights. Karen had installed temporary floodlights near the top platform, aimed directly over the orchard so the kids could zipline at twilight. That was it. Tom stood there in the growing dark, hands clenched at his sides, and made a quiet promise to himself. This wasn't going to be solved with more letters or phone calls. Karen had built her little kingdom on someone else's land. It was time she discovered what happened when you zipline into enemy territory. Tom didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with a notepad and a growing list of offenses. Floodlights, noise pollution, trespassing, property damage, unauthorized construction, monetized public use of private land. The list was so absurd it read like a satire piece, but Tom wasn't laughing anymore. He went out early the next morning, just as the sun peeked over the hills. The orchard was quiet again, for now. Pigs snuffled peacefully in the sty. Birds hopped between the branches, reclaiming their space. Tom walked the entire length of the zipline, inspecting the cable, its anchor points, and most interesting of all, the landing zone. Karen had marked it with spray paint and tiny orange cones like it was some kind of adventure park attraction. The final few feet of the line dipped downward just enough that every single rider, if not caught properly, landed within steps of the pig enclosure. As Tom stood there, Karen's earlier words echoed in his head. "You don't mind a little fun, do you?" He did, especially when it wasn't hers to have. But revenge wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about tearing the cable down in a fit of rage or calling in the sheriff to mediate a petty war. No, this was about being smarter, craftier, and patient. Tom started with research. He visited the county records office to confirm once again that the sliver of land beyond the Oak Crest fence, where Karen's zipline tower stood, was indeed part of his property. A surveying error years ago had left the boundary slightly unclear, but Tom had documentation to prove ownership. He even found the old wooden stakes still buried in the grass. Then he called his friend Jesse, a retired contractor with a sharp sense of humor and a fondness for harmless mischief. Over beers that evening, Tom laid out the situation, step by ridiculous step. By the end of the story, Jessie was howling with laughter. She really zipped kids over pigs. Yep, and charged for it. Jessie wiped a tear from his eye. All right then, let's give her a landing they'll never forget. They spent the next 2 days laying the groundwork, quietly, carefully, and with just the right amount of irony. Karen kept running her little ride, oblivious. Kids flew past Tom's trees like cannonballs. Parents waved at him like he was the mascot of their favorite attraction. And Tom? He just smiled now, calm and cool, watching as Karen zipped herself closer and closer to a reckoning. Because when this trap was set, it would be a masterpiece. Tom's plan began taking shape that Monday morning. The zipline cable remained in place, the orchard was still buzzing with uninvited laughter, and Karen was as oblivious as ever. But below the surface, right at the zipline's landing zone, things were changing. Jessie arrived with his toolbox, a wheelbarrow full of supplies, and a devilish grin. They started by shifting the pigpen fence back about 6 feet, extending the muddy perimeter right into what had been Karen's makeshift landing platform. Then they replaced the old wooden slats with a fresh coating of non-slip ramping, but one that gently tilted downward, directly into the messiest part of the sty, just enough to ensure a slippery surprise. Tom also added a little landscaping of his own. He relocated several pig troughs right up to the edge of the cable's end. With some coaxing and clever food placement, the pigs began congregating there, lounging in their mud and hay, forming an eager audience for the incoming zipliners. They worked fast. Every modification looked innocuous, like maintenance or natural wear and tear, nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, just gravity, pigs, and mud. Next, Tom called in a favor from his cousin Patty, who ran the county permit office. He asked for an official-looking notice to be printed and mailed to Karen's HOA, informing them of an upcoming boundary review due to multiple complaints of unauthorized recreational infrastructure. He knew Karen wouldn't take it seriously, until it was far too late. And finally, just to sweeten the trap, Tom added one subtle but perfect touch, a wooden signpost placed right at the landing zone. Painted in a playful cursive font, it read, "Welcome to the Hog Wild Experience, landing zone ahead." Karen didn't even notice it, too busy posing with a new batch of lemonade cups and shouting at kids to tuck their knees. Tom kept to himself, tending to his trees like nothing was happening. But every time another child came flying down the line and skidded just shy of disaster, he grinned. Because he knew, sooner or later, Karen wouldn't just supervise the zipline, she'd ride it herself. It was inevitable. She loved the spotlight too much to resist. And when she did, that landing was going to be the stuff of legend. The big day came faster than Tom expected. Saturday morning broke clear and warm, the perfect weather for ziplining, apparently. By 10 a.m., a crowd had gathered again near the fence. Karen had outdone herself this time, setting up a snack stand, a cooler of drinks, and a small Bluetooth speaker pumping out upbeat pop tunes. She wore a brand new neon pink tracksuit with Zip Boss embroidered on the back, and pranced around like she was emceeing a televised event. Tom watched from his porch, coffee in hand, trying not to laugh every time a kid zipped down and let out a confused yelp when the pigs wandered too close. The revised landing zone was working like a charm. The gentle tilt of the ramp, the positioning of the pig troughs, the pigsty fence moved just so. It was all combining into a perfectly calibrated slip-and slide into barnyard chaos. But then, just before noon, it happened. Karen clapped her hands and called for everyone's attention. "Okay, folks, since today marks one whole week of the Caronland zipline experience, I think it's time I join the fun." The crowd cheered. Tom nearly spit out his coffee. Karen strutted up the platform steps like she was ascending the stage at an awards show. "Now remember," she said with a wink, strapping herself into the harness, "keep your legs up and your sass high." Tom stood, casually walked to the fence, and leaned against a post, just in time to see her launch. She whooshed over the orchard, arms outstretched, shrieking with joy as she zipped past the apple trees. Wee-ee. And then the descent began. Karen's eyes widened. She hit the slope a little too fast. The ramp, slick with a carefully timed overnight watering and the natural buildup of the pigs' favorite muddy wallow, offered no grip. Her feet touched down, slipped immediately, and she tumbled forward in a blur of arms, legs, and pastel fabric, straight into the muddiest section of the sty. The pigs, startled, scattered with joyful grunts. Karen slid through the slop, her whistle flying from her neck and vanishing in a puddle. She came to a stop beneath Tom's sign, mud-covered, spluttering, and nose-to-snout with a very curious pig named Winston. For a moment there was silence. Then the entire crowd burst out laughing. Cameras came out. A dad shouted, "Karen, you okay?" between wheezing fits. Kids screamed with laughter. Someone yelled. She landed in the VIP section. Tom slowly walked toward the fence, hands in his pockets, and met Karen's horrified eyes. She sat in the muck, sputtering and slipping every time she tried to stand. "You always wanted to make a splash," Tom called out with a friendly smile. "Looks like you finally did." She screamed something unintelligible and slipped again, face first into a pig trough. Justice at last had arrived, in boots, overalls, and a perfectly placed pigsty. Karen emerged from the pigsty like a soap opera villain escaping a mudslide, sputtering, slippery, and absolutely furious. Her once neon tracksuit was now a dripping patchwork of brown and hay. Her hair, once a perfectly blow-dried helmet, clung to her face in sticky clumps. One false eyelash dangled mid-cheek like a tiny surrender flag. The crowd didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. Some tried to hide their giggles, others didn't bother. A teenager filming the whole thing burst into uncontrollable cackles and yelled, "Yo, this is going straight to TikTok." Tom, leaning on the fence, kept a straight face, though his eyes sparkled with a satisfaction that couldn't be hidden. Karen finally managed to stand, sort of, while slipping and squishing her way toward the ramp. That was sabotage," she shrieked. You set me up, Ellery." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You mean you zipped onto private property, into a pig pen you refused to acknowledge existed, and now you're mad the pigs didn't roll out a red carpet?" She stumbled up the ramp, leaving a trail of squelch behind her. "This was deliberate. That ramp, that mud, that sign, you're going to regret this." "Oh, I doubt it," Tom replied. "But I'd love to hear how you'll explain this to the county inspector when he shows up Monday to discuss that whole, unauthorized recreational infrastructure on someone else's land situation." Karen froze, pig mud dripping from her elbows. "What inspector?" Tom grinned. "Oh, didn't you get the letter? Must have been hard to read through all that glitter ink you use." Karen turned to the crowd, trying to salvage her shattered dignity. "The zipline is temporarily closed for maintenance and sanitation," she announced, throwing her hands in the air as a clump of mud flung off her sleeve and hit someone's lemonade. She stormed off toward her house, trailing muck across her pristine backyard. Parents murmured to each other. A few quietly packed up their lawn chairs. The mood had shifted from amusement to discomfort. Karen, queen of HOA tyranny, had been dethroned, publicly, by pigs. Later that afternoon, Tom watched as a few Oak Crest residents returned, this time to help take the zipline down. No fanfare, no music, just quiet cooperation and many, many sideways glances toward Karen's house. He didn't lift a finger, he didn't have to. Sometimes the best revenge is mud-drenched and self-inflicted. A week later, peace settled back over the orchard like a warm blanket. The pigs resumed their lazy lives without the daily bombardment of screaming children, and the apple trees swayed gently in the breeze, free from the threat of airborne trespassers. Tom stood on his porch once again, sipping his coffee, enjoying the return of quiet, a sound more precious than gold. The zipline was gone, the platform dismantled. The Karenland sign had mysteriously vanished, though Tom had a strong suspicion it now hung ironically in someone's garage, possibly under a banner reading Suburban Legends. Karen, on the other hand, had gone quiet. Completely quiet. No more HOA emails, no clipboard marches, no Zip Boss tracksuits. The once unstoppable force of neighborhood micromanagement was now the subject of whispered jokes and awkward smiles. Kids still talked about the mud splash heard round the world. Teenagers recreated the fall in slow-motion videos. Even local parents who once supported her zipline now offered Tom sheepish apologies and home-baked pies. And the cherry on top. A county notice was officially posted on Corinne's back fence, a violation for unauthorized construction, use of private property, and operating an unlicensed recreational structure. The fine wasn't small. Rumor had it she'd tried to argue the zipline was a goodwill gesture, but the photos, oh, the many photos, painted a very different picture. One morning, as Tom tended his garden near the fence line, he saw Corinne sneak out to scrub a bit of remaining mud from her patio pavers. She looked around nervously before spotting him. They locked eyes. Tom gave her a calm, polite nod. She flinched and scurried back inside. It was perfect. Justice hadn't come with sirens or lawsuits. It had come with pigs, patience, and a little bit of strategic landscaping. And in the end, Tom didn't just get his peace back. He earned the quiet respect of every neighbor who'd ever suffered through Corinne's HOA tyranny. That Sunday, Jesse stopped by with a six-pack and a grin. "So," he said, settling into a porch chair, "what do we do if she tries to turn the place into a paintball field next?" Tom chuckled, eyes twinkling. "Then I introduce her to the goats." They clinked bottles and leaned back, the orchard stretching peacefully around them. The zipline saga was over. The orchard was his again. And somewhere deep in her glitter-filled lair, Corinne was probably still picking straw out of her hair. Poetic justice had never smelled quite so agricultural.